I'm not trying to talk about the issues of street commerce and legality of spaces, but it's the idea about testing conventions. And you know, taking over, you can take over an empty lot in New York and turn it into a public market geared for, run by ethnic Chinese and Africans living in New York. But you can also translate that to the GTA, where we're starting to operate out of maybe old commercial spaces, over older strip malls. I don't know if Robert, if this is I mean, sort of Ron, if this is any of interest to you, but you know, the idea of these commercial spaces that might have reached the end of their useful life based on a different social contract, if I can be so, you know, high-minded political, but in today's world, the ethnic mix of our suburbs could breathe new life into older commercial paradigms by switching their understanding. So that mutability is the resource. And you see it, you know, going from, there's a few steps to go from this kind of mall out in Mississauga to this kind of high-end, luxurious Asian mall out in Richmond, British Columbia. But the roots are still there. There's still the suburbia that you see on the right-hand side of the image, and you have the emergence of the new global connected suburban marketplace on the left. You know, so back to that first slide, when you have issues of ethnic groups living in East London, and you have new architecture catered strictly for them. I won't get into the program, but there's an employment center, library, resource center, there's a store, but you understand that beneath that, there's physically, literally there's a layer of informality that exists within the dynamic. We understand by informality, you know, by just loose marketplaces versus the taut curtain wall type of building. So understanding our landscape and maximizing that landscape is a way to give us a hook to hang our hats on. So when we see that simultaneity, as these kind of more artsy slides show of corner of Huron, Ontario, and Dundas and Mississauga do, or when you're driving down the Don Valley Parkway, as some of you did to get up here today, and you see you know, you're driving on this road, but you're not seeing, or what you're not appreciating is the park space that's used for, you know, for different celebrations from various communities that live in Thorncliffe Park. That's peeking in from the left-hand side of the image. And when you go to Thorncliffe Park, this is a very different world than this, right? You don't, when you're driving here, you don't see this, which is just over yonder. And you certainly don't see this, which is in sort of more Crescent Town. And that same park space beside the DVP is you have communities playing cricket, or in other areas of the city, you start seeing people using landscape that wasn't initially intended when towers were going up, but you start seeing people, apartment tenants going out in the middle of the summer having picnics and socializing in ways that the North American planner hadn't realized when the knit tower initially went up. So again, maybe extending the useful life of this paradigm of the tower in the park. There's that cricket, again, happening in Thorncliffe Park. But the social capital that exists in these areas, whether it's community gardens or whether it's the school, which is near Thorncliffe Park, to try and raise money for a cricket field. And you start to see what's happening here, where there's a pent-up demand, a need, people coming together, raising money for public space. Obviously, our governments are not maybe as quick to respond to their issues, so they take it into their own hand for positive outcome. Thorncliffe Park, a social capital, when you see 35 different nationalities in one public school, you start to think, okay, well, you know, there's something going on. Again, the suburbs. People, you know, this is the Aga Khan Development Network building a huge landscape, a religious center, and a cultural center on Winford Drive, not too far from actually where I work, but just off the Don Valley Parkway again. And it's a global center for pluralism. It's a global center for religious purposes and also for cultural purposes as well. And when you start seeing this happening in the suburbs and why they selected this versus a downtown site, again, it comes back to the question, It was socially, it had a social and political purpose. It was strong, and that's strong for the a lot of the Smileys living in Toronto, to have this kind of global center. It's no surprise that the architecture and the landscape is equally defined. So here, when you have it, an example of a Sikh spiritual center kind of taking over an old Mark's Work warehouse and developing it into something, again, extending the useful life based on a shift in demographics. And then we start seeing these all over the city, various religious centers, even operating out of sort of warehousing centers. But that evolves, and I guess that evolution is that step that starts to, that we're kind of yearning for in our suburban environments, where you can go from this kind of environment to this kind of church, a different community, but still the example of building this in the suburbs to create an identifiable, an iconic, a spiritual place that provides a gathering. I'm sure many of you may not be familiar with this image, but it's kind of, again, another religious center, but it's not in the modern idiom, but it's about transporting piece by piece carved marble elements from India to the tip of Toronto and Mississauga there, where to build this, I don't know if you've seen you might have seen this, those of you who live in the region, when you're traveling up Highway 400, yeah, that's it.
No,
410. I keep getting mixed up. You're going, yeah,
410? 427. 427.
427. Yes. Yeah.
427.
Yes, that's right. You veer to the right, go up, and then you keep going. I often come out from the other direction, but you definitely see this when you're heading north. And it's kind of what's interesting is this design has kind of been used all over the world. It's almost like franchise architecture at a multi-million-dollar scale, but it represents a community coming together to build a piece of their identity in Toronto's suburban landscape. But what's interesting is it starts to bring in other sort of political philosophy ideas about cosmopolitanism, where you're actually not assimilating within a Canadian culture, but you're almost a guest. I don't know if you want to introduce that concept, but when you're coming, you're still exercising your identity, but you're doing it almost as if you still have a piece of you in another part of the world. And politically and economically, that can be a very positive thing, and socially too, because it provides a greater aspect of connectivity and even builds cohesive communities within the Canadian context. So again, more resources, like we see this happening. This rendering is, to the non-architects, very interesting, but to an architect, very interesting because we don't see this kind of gouache rendering in North America. It's a very common rendering style in other parts of the world. So it's odd to see that rendering happen here in Mississauga, to promote the kind of building here in Mississauga, which was this, under construction, the great Punjab Business Center, and under completion, with sort of public art components built in, but it's Mughal-inspired building, even though it's tilt-up concrete, precast concrete, but its elements, as you can see in the distance, sort of law offices and immigration offices, travel, insurance, restaurants, etc. But again, it's building that sort of genus loci that you start to see in more downtown corners, but in a suburban environment, where you see posters of various activities happening, even on this sort of desolate, non-pedestrian friendly street. So again, another resources is financial incentives. This is Mississauga, right? And when they're redesigning your Mississauga City Square, Civic Center, and all down, here Ontario and Dundas, and a kind of I wouldn't say cheesy sort of, the plans for this particular corner, trying to be very ethnographic, but emphasis on the graphic rather than the ethno, because this region is a much more diverse and fluid urban environment than we would expect. But the city of Mississauga has to deal some work with understanding how to leverage this kind of the financial ladder that we hope this area will evolve over time. This is another photo of the area. There's a lot of businesses. There's a lot of traffic, it's a very urban potential, and so no matter how do you capture that urbanistically while leveraging the social component. This project, I'll just go through briefly. Many of you are familiar with Pacific Mall. I don't know if many of you are familiar with how the malls are often, for guests, you may not be familiar with this. We would. Oh yeah, but they were sold. You know that they were not rented, but they're sold as strata, and that used to be that one unit would almost equate one visa, because the amount of, if you're an investor class from Asia coming to Canada, you used to have to bring in $250,000. So the developers keyed in that one store or component would be $250,000 and it's yours. And so you buy a store and you come to Canada, and it's all keyed into an economic cycle. And it's a very interesting cycle that's the origins of Pacific Mall. And then another aspect of that, when it was built, the town of Markham was what, about 50,000 people or something like that in the mid-90s, and today it's close to 300,000. But when it was built, they didn't want it to be Chinese looking, they wanted it to be traditional looking. So you see the traditional looking false storefronts that were initially established, right? There's like one giant Chinese grocery market behind this facade. But what's interesting to see is as this will evolve, it will start to kind of anchor a new form of urbanity. And that's a resource, anchoring. Whether it's anchoring within, this one's more of a passive anchoring. It's kind of a Chinese, looks like a Chinese Home Depot, but it's pulling up the visual cues of the status quo, but it's anchored within a new approach to urbanity that's very connected to the community, in this case in Brampton. Or in this case, a grocery store, one of the best grocery stores for best halal butchers in the city, and yet it's operating out of a keyed-in architecture that we don't perceive as being very progressive. Same thing here. So if you anchor it, how do you make history with it? How do you give myth to your to multiculturalism in the suburbs? Do you have, in this case, Taste of the Lawrence, where you start having public fairs that serve up various types of food and merchants, a low barrier, economic barrier of entry to create, I guess in this case, if you want to call it an ethnographic spectacle, albeit for 4 days, but it starts to open up new opportunities, and almost new opportunities for normalcy. A woman in a sari or a Suburbanisms watching her kid on a merry-go-round in Scarborough starts to become the norm.